let's get this show on the road. We're 1500. I will say that the last couple of games, it's been a while since we've had. So yesterday we had a game which kind of dragged on for a while, but I really enjoyed our discussion afterward on, various important concepts that occurred. So hopefully you've been enjoying it so far. On we go to another game. We are 15-17, so things really kind of heating up and getting interesting. I think we'll have the black pieces. Let's roll the cameras and get this show on the road. All right, no, we have the white pieces, and we're playing at 1600, so very decent player. And here we go. E4, C6, nice. We're going to get another fantasy variation, which we've been exploring quite a bit. I think we've already had 2 games in the fantasy, and so we've explored quite a bit of theory already. And, just to reiterate the philosophy of the speedrun, the higher rated we get, the more deeply we're going to examine the openings in the games that we play, because the more theory we're going to get from our opponents. D takes C4. We faced this move before, and in the previous game, I think our opponent played a pretty big mistake, knight F6, and here we go again. This guy repeats the same exact line. You might remember that the only way to justify this line is to play the move E5. It's critical for black to play E5. Otherwise, you're essentially getting a bad version of an Alekhine, which is already a pretty bad opening to begin with. So I'll be impressed if people can remember the previous game. This was maybe 5 or 6 games ago. It's up on YouTube. If you're watching this on YouTube and you don't know what I'm talking about, you can pause and find the previous game in the Caro-Kann, and you can watch that video first. We're going to basically repeat everything that we did in that game. And I don't remember exactly what we did, but I do remember that the move in this position, of course, is E5, much like in the Alekhine. And this is a very awkward version of an Alekhine because the pawn on C6 belongs on C5 in order to break down white's center. So that's a loss of a tempo already. And second of all, the semi-open F file is in white's favor. This is very important to understand. You might look at this and say, isn't our king weak here? And to that I say, well, think of it in the long run. After we complete our kingside development and we castle, our rook on F1 is going to be aiming at F7. So there's a high probability that we win this game with a direct assault on the F7 pawn. So here we have basically a choice of 2 approaches to repeat what I was mentioning in the previous game. We can play this developmentally. We can play knight F3 and bishop B2 or whatnot and then castle short. But the more ambitious way to play this is to occupy more of the center, to chase the knight away from D5, much like we do in the Alekhine. And we want to play principal chess. Let's send this knight back to Timbuktu with the move C4. And this is indeed what we did previously. Now, in that previous game, I'm pretty sure that our opponent played knight to C7. So this is the first substantive deviation. Knight B6 is a somewhat more logical move because the knight maintains contact with the C4 pawn. And now we obviously need to develop our pieces in order to support our large center, in order to make sure that the center doesn't fall apart. So in what order do we develop our pieces? Another point that I made in the previous game is that we shouldn't necessarily rush the move knight F3, because knight F3 allows black to develop the bishop to G4. Is that pin the end of the world? Absolutely not. But a smarter way to develop here is to try to wait it out, wait for black to play bishop F5, and then develop the knight to F3, because the bishop on F5 is clearly inferior to an annoying bishop on G4. So we start with the most flexible developing moves. In this case, those moves, I think, are knight to C3 and then bishop to E3. We don't want to go bishop to D3 because that hangs the pawn on D4. So if we do develop the bishop, we'd probably develop it to E2, or we can play bishop to E3, supporting the pawn, and then bishop to D3. But all of this should be taken with a grain of salt. We need to wait for black to develop for us to decide. There we go. Bishop F5 is on the board, and now we can very comfortably develop the knight to F3 because it's not worth for black to waste another tempo to reposition the bishop. We'd be happy to see that. So hopefully you can understand the logic. Let's go with knight F3. And I'm assuming black is going to go E6. And you should temper your expectations. This is an important point about punishing bad openings. Normally when a mistake is made along the lines of knight f6, you shouldn't fall into the trap of assuming that you're suddenly winning or that you should expect to have a winning position in 10 moves. That's not how chess works. I would estimate the evaluation to be maybe +1. So, white has a clear advantage here, but we should not be looking for a knockout blow because you're not going to find one, and that's only going to lead you down a very dangerous path where you're likely to overextend yourself. So the next dilemma is which bishop we should develop. I think we should focus on our king side because I want to get the king out of the center as quickly as possible, and I also want to reap the benefit of the f-file as quickly as possible. So that leads us to the light squared bishop. Now, where should we go? Well, along the same lines, what's stopping us from benefiting from the f-file? The bishop on f5 is kind of an annoying roadblock. So I don't see any reason for us not to play the move bishop d3. We're happy with the trade of light squared bishops. It's not, our light squared bishop isn't necessary for the attack. And once we get rid of the bishops, we unfetter the f-file, and we're happy. Very important point. Whenever you have a big center like this, you always have to make sure that your opponent can't cut into the center with their pawns. A move like c5 can be incredibly nasty, and if black can get this pawn on d4 off the board, white's center is likely to collapse. So importantly, and we talked about this in the previous game as well, c5 can be met with the move d5. If you count the defenders, we have 2 defenders on that square and 2 attackers. So we're chilling. But we should make a mental note to ourselves on every move, literally, to just double check to make sure that c5 can still be met with d5. Bishop e7, okay, we obviously castle. We've completed our kingside development. And I assume our opponent is also going to castle. So here we have an interesting, very interesting moment, actually, because I think the majority of you, as you're looking at the position, your instinct is probably to play bishop e3 here. Or maybe some of you want bishop f4, which I don't like because it blocks the f-file. Maybe some of you are tempted by c5. c5 is a very bad move positionally because it gifts black a monster outpost in the center on d5. There's no need to play c5 here. Perhaps some of you are contemplating a move like b3 to solidify the pawn. But I have far more violent thoughts on my mind. When I look at this position, I actually have a feeling that we can go directly for checkmate here. We can exploit the fact that black hasn't even completed his queenside development, and we can try to pounce before black even knows what hit him. Now, what does it mean to pounce in this position, right? We can't play knight g5. This is a move that all of you should see, and you should understand its general value. If we can get knight g5, that's a huge mate threat. And the great thing about this particular type of mate threat is that black can't defend with h6. That defends the pawn, but not the square. So if we can force black to make a tremendously weakening move like this, we'll already be, 3 steps to delivering checkmate. So can we prepare the move knight g5 while building more harmony among our pieces? Yes, we can. And as many of you are indicating, I am very tempted by the move knight e4. And I'm going to think about this for just another second. The thing is, after knight e4, obviously black can play h6 and prevent knight g5. So the question is it worth inducing that move? Or should we hold our horses and play positionally with bishop e3? Both approaches are entirely possible. So I'm going to take 30 seconds just to make that decision. Because there is a subtle but not insignificant downside to playing knight e4. And I know I'm talking a lot in this example, in this position, but it's an important position to really understand what's going on. The downside of knight e4 is that after h6, we made a mental note to ourselves. What did that note say? To check c5 on every move. Notice that after we move the knight away from c3, we will no longer be able to meet c5 with d5 because now the d5 square has insufficient defenders. But I saw one step ahead. We are going to play knight e4 because after h6, I think I've spotted a really cute move, a move that solves all of our problems in the center and puts the heat on all sides of the board. So we're going to wait for black to play h6 because that's far from forced. Black could try c5 straight away, and that will lead us to a direct tactical skirmish. So we'll see what our opponent chooses. It's entirely possible that knight e4 is a mistake. It's entirely possible that, I'm playing this in a slightly overzealous manner, but I really don't think so. This just has to work. All of the ingredients are in place. Our center is amazing. Our queen is aiming at h7. Knight e4 flows naturally from the position. Okay, so I think our opponent is deciding between h6. Maybe he's thinking g6. No, he's not. He's ignoring. He's calling my bluff. He's saying, come at me, brah. And to that, I say, yes, I will. So here we go. Now, here we go can mean two different things. This is actually a very important moment. Most of you are obviously thinking, let's go knight eg5, right? What would be the point of bringing the other knight to g5? Well, actually, we're going to play knight f to g5. Why? Knight f to g5 still creates a mate threat. If you look carefully, the mate threat is knight f6 check, discovered check, essentially, and then queen takes h7 mate. And the beautiful thing about knight f g5 is that it's a more efficient division of labor than bringing the other knight to g5. If you think about it, after knight e to g5, black plays g6, and we have a slightly awkward situation where the knight on f3 is blocking the queen from moving to h3. It's blocking the rook from attacking f7. Meanwhile, if we bring the other knight to g5 and get black to take it, not only do we remove a very important defender, but also after knight takes g5, our queen is free to roam about the third rank. It's just a far more harmonious position. Hopefully that logic also makes sense. We go knight f g5. Far more effective. And if black is not careful, obviously this game could end in checkmate on the next move. Now, what's interesting is that after bishop takes g5, this might blow your mind, but I think the best move there is actually bishop takes g5, because I've noticed essentially a mating pattern that I think leads to immediate victory. And the way that I see this is just that I know the pattern. That's all there is to it. And if our opponent takes the knight, then I'll be able to show you the pattern. Yeah, a lot of you are indicating it in chat. There's this idea of sacking the knight on f6 and essentially delivering a version of the lobster pincer mate with, a piece on f6 and then a piece on h6. Everybody should know what I'm talking about. When you have a pawn on f6 and a queen on h6 and mate on g7 is unstoppable. It's essentially a version of that mate along the dark squares. And if he doesn't do it, I'll show it after the game. So the most resilient move for black here is undoubtedly g6. And in response to g6, you should kind of be asking yourself what catches your eye, because there's a couple of very tempting moves there. I still haven't decided yet. So I'm going to do a little thinking on that front. g6 is played. Very, very nicely done by our opponent. Now, we need to be careful here, because notice that the d4 pawn is only defended once. Now, we can sacrifice that pawn, and you should also understand that queen takes d4 check is really not the end of the world. We can block that check with bishop e3. We can even step aside with our king. So we shouldn't reject a move just because it gives away the pawn, but we should be aware of it. So I think we have basically two candidate moves. There is the tempting move knight f6 check, which virtually compels black to take on f6. And then we have a total monopoly over the dark squares on the king side. And total monopoly over a set of squares is an incredibly valuable resource that you can directly transform into checkmate. And we'll discuss that more after the game. The second candidate move is queen to h3. Note that after queen takes d4 check, bishop e3, that's a double attack. We threaten the queen and we threaten checkmate. So queen h3 forces black to go h5. And that's another massive, massive weakening. So queen h3 makes a lot of sense, but we need a follow-up after h5. And it's not that easy to find one. It's not that easy to break through black's defenses on the king side. A lot of you are saying g4, but that's slow, and then black takes on d4 and takes on e5, and your center collapses. I'm far from convinced that that leads to a clean checkmate. So from that perspective, I'm tempted by the appearance of knight f6 check. Let me think about this for a couple more moments. I'm going to try to be clinical here. There. I have a very interesting idea, But I'm working it out. I'm working it out to calculate it. Yeah, there's all sorts of sacrifices there, but nothing that's quite as convincing as I would like for it to be. But there's one variation. I'm trying to work it out. It's complicated. It's complicated. So I'm leaning toward just going knight f6 check. I'm leaning towards going knight f6 check. Bishop takes f6. Rook takes f6. And basically saying, listen, I've got, a long-term attack on the king side. I'm going to secure my advantages. I'm going to bank it. And then we're going to try to look for the knockout blow. Let's go knight f6 check. Let's show some restraint. I did not see a forced win after queen h3, h5. I'm sure the engine will, but given our time situation, I think the practical option, the practical choice is to play a lower risk move that we know is going to yield long-term attacking chances. Now, if bishop takes f6, and by the way, those on YouTube, I am recovering from a cold, so, apologize for my voice. If bishop takes f6, it's tempting, I know, to take with the pawn. But the downside of taking with the pawn, the huge downside, is that you're blocking the f-file, and the f-file is one of the main avenues of attack. In fact, our entire opening strategy revolves around attacking down the f-file. So the only reason you would take with the pawn is if you could guarantee that you could land the queen on h6. That is the lobster pincer mate. Can you make that guarantee? Well, not really, because after ef6, wait a second, there's knight takes h7 after ef6, so I actually wouldn't rule it out. Oh, this changes a lot. Wait a moment. No, that changes everything. So here's what I saw. After e takes f6, we have a massive threat. We have the threat of playing knight takes h7. And after king takes h7, we swing the queen from h3 to h6 with the lobster pincer mate that we've been talking about. So I actually think e takes f6 is worth playing. Of course, my initial idea was to play rook takes f6, and we'll explore that after the game. I'm not convinced that I'm playing in the best possible way, but I really, really hope that we'll get a chance to carry out this maneuver, this idea. Now, another very important point. A lot of you are probably wondering, well, what about a move like h6 here? Or what about a move like h5, setting up the defensive pawn shell? Well, then you should spot a tactic, right? The queen is aiming at g6. The pawn on f7 is overloaded. We play knight takes e6, classic deflection. And if f takes e6, then queen takes g6, queen g7 is checkmate. All right, everybody should see that. And this is if black pushes the h-pawn. Anytime a pawn is pushed, other pawns become weaker. Other squares become weaker. You should ingrain that in your mind, especially when you've got situations that are highly charged from a tactical standpoint. And you know this position is, right? You know there's mating ideas. You know there's tactics. So you have to put your tactical hat on, so to speak. Yeah, black is probably lost, but I have a feeling that if our opponent finds an accurate defensive move, I don't know which one, but I don't think the game is totally over. But the story of this position is not only the weakness of black's king, but the inactivity, as somebody in the chat is pointing out, of the knights. You just cannot play a successful middle game with both of your minor pieces essentially out of commission for good. Not only are they not participating in the defense, they're not even participating in a counterattack. They're just sort of sitting there, and we have, for that reason, a massive superiority on the other side of the board. So there is a cute move, knight to c5. Okay, there we go. h5. This has worked like a charm. Knight takes e6, okay? Just double checking, because there is one complicating move, but it doesn't work. We play knight takes e6, deflection, overloading. If fe6, this is mate in 2. And the f-pawn decides the game. Now, of course, black needs to move the queen, but then we take our rook and we bank the material advantage, but then we keep attacking. And I'll make this point once we get to that position, but a lot of people, what tends to happen in these situations is that you grab the material and then you say, the game is over, I can just start simplifying. No, right? Being up material is even more of a reason to play for checkmate, okay? So after knight takes f8, we're not just going to try to trade queens and cower and some endgame. We're just going to step on the gas pedal and try to finish the game off. Okay, queen to d6. Queen to d6. Interesting stuff. Now, what's hilarious is that we don't necessarily have to play knight takes f8. There are some alternatives, but given the time situation, we're not even going to toy with them. We're going to go knight f8, and we are going to claim our material advantage. Okay, so of course, you should notice that c5 is a false friend because black has knight takes c5 and the queen is unprotected, right? Always notice these x-rays between pieces. So what is the ideal scenario? The ideal scenario is for us to get our queen to h6. So from that perspective, we get the idea of playing queen to e3. But the issue with queen e3, well, the good thing about queen e3 is that it also reinforces the threat of c5. So it's actually a double attack. But after queen e3, black has an annoying defensive move. Queen e3, notice that black has knight back to d7, attacking the f6 pawn. Okay. If we play queen h6, black is in time to eliminate the pawn from f6, and black survives. So amazingly, queen e3, knight d7, we have to find a response there. And I'm thinking about one, but I don't yet see something that I'm totally happy with there. Yeah, we can play c5 first, knight takes c5, and then queen e3, but then the other knight drops back to d7, and it creates the same effect. We cannot afford to lose this pawn. That greatly complicates the winning process. So let's kind of wipe the slate clean, and let's forget for a second about playing for immediate checkmate. Instead, let's focus on building up some more fundamentals. We need a little bit more beef. We need to bring all the toys to the nursery party. And I think I see a very nice way of doing that. The fundamental problem is that we don't have enough pieces developed, right? We're struggling because we're offloading all of the work just to the rook. Our entire queen side is, you know, like a jar of cookies yet to be opened. We have all of this good stuff that can come out. Let's bring it out. Now, what's the nicest way to bring it out? The nicest way to bring it out, I think, is not bishop h6, because we want to leave that square open for the queen. But using a little bit of tactics, we can develop the bishop to another square with tempo. Very good. I'm impressed with how many people are pointing this out. Am I not blundering the pawn on f6? That's what our opponent is wondering. Well, the f-file decides the game. We have the x-ray on the queen. The x-ray is a precursor to a discovered attack. What can we attack? We can't check the king because it's on a light square. If the king was on h8, we would have played bishop e5 with the pin. But obviously, we have bishop to h6, winning a second exchange. And that essentially decides the game. Okay, maybe I over-explained that, but moves like bishop f4 are, you know, really often the difference between winning the game in 5 more moves and, you know, winning the game in 50 moves, or maybe not winning the game at all. You know, allowing your opponent to stick around. And if you don't have a lot of time, it's especially important to find these moves and play them accurately. All right, we take the rook. Now, again, we still should not rest on our laurels. We definitely should not aim for a queen trade here. We should continue playing for mate. Okay, so we still can't really go c5 because of knight takes c5, all right? So that's important to notice. So as many of you are pointing out, we should bring the rook into the game. Where should we put it? Well, I love the look of rook a e1 because that's an open file. You could also make a case for rook a to d1 because that reinforces the threat of c5. But if we want to play this clinically, then we should definitely go rook a to e1. No sacks on f7. None of that nonsense unless you've calculated to checkmate. All right, you got to be disciplined. Kudos to our opponent. He's trying everything. Now, we don't take the knight. That blunders the queen. We move the queen. Where do we go? Well, what's the most natural square? Why did we put the rook on e1? Well, we did that in order to be able to infiltrate down the e-file. So we have queen f3, but that allows queen takes d4 check. Sloppy. The move is queen e3. Using more tactics. Knight e6, we have the x-ray on the king. That means the f7 pawn is immobile. And we have, of course, the move c5 as an option. But if we want to play a little bit more elegantly, bang. Queen takes c6 is pretty. And that's it. I think that's one too many pieces. Queen takes d4 check is nothing to be afraid of. As long as black cannot dislodge the rook, which of course he cannot, the game is over. Right? And this is why good beginner tactics books emphasize themes. First and foremost, you have to learn the tactical ingredients of each position. If you solve blindly without knowing the underlying concepts, then it's hard to generalize them, right? And this is also an illustration of the importance of making observations before you see the tactic, right? I noticed this a long time ago. The moment king appeared on f8, I made a mental note to myself, okay, the f7 pawn, essentially, it's as if it isn't there, right? It's not actually defending either of these squares. And that's how you see stuff like queen takes e6 quickly. Let's have a look. Pretty straightforward game. And another successful fantasy variation. So I won't repeat what I said in the previous Caro-Kann game. Again, if you haven't seen that video or you want a refresher on what we discussed there, pause the video, take a look at that other video. And in that video, I pretty extensively went over the move e5. I gave you a pretty extensive overview. The move here for white is knight f3. And essentially here, black has three main moves. There's bishop g4, which is most popular and the best move. There's e takes d4, which is now considered very dubious. And there's bishop to e6, which is also very dubious. And you can take a look at that video for the theoretical overview. What I'll say in this video to advance our knowledge of the fantasy is that apart from d takes e4, there are 3 or 4 very reputable alternatives. And the one that most grandmasters play and that I faced most often online at my level is this move e6, which you could almost argue transposes the game into a version of the French with the inclusion of the move c6 and f3. But that actually really changes the nature of the position. And the funny thing here is that after the correct move, knight c3, if black plays knight f6, who can tell me how you can actually transpose directly into a variation of the French, which is often not to the liking of a Caro-Kann player, because most Caro-Kann players don't play the French. Very good. You can play e5, knight fd7, f4, and after c5, black has nothing better. Knight f3, knight c6, you've transposed directly into a main variation of the classical French, which occurs after e4, e6, d4, d5, knight c3, knight f6. This is the classical variation. The win hour is bishop b4, but knight f6 is also very reputable. And white's main line here is to play f4, c5, and after knight f3, knight c6, bishop b3, you get literally the same position. So most Caro-Kann players here actually go win hour style with bishop to b4. And we had a game here as well in the previous speedrun where we faced a slightly questionable opponent. The move here for white is, let me actually remember. So the main line, I think, is bishop to f4, but that's not what I recommend. I recommend the move a3, which is actually a fascinating pawn sacrifice. And the reason this is a sacrifice is that black can play bishop c3 and then d takes e4. And you can't take back because of the nasty check on h4. I'll be super impressed if somebody in the chat can remember what the move here is for white. We had this position. I lost that game, but I was much better out of the opening. All right, Mamba on Discord deserves a sub. All of you remember it's knight h3. Honestly, amazing to see how many people pay attention. Knight h3 is the move that you literally just have to know. It's hard to figure this move out. And the idea is to develop the knight and to threaten the move f takes c4. Because then queen h4 can be met with the move knight back to f2. So you can take a look at that game as well. I think that's the beauty of the speedrun, right? Our knowledge, it builds up on each other. That's why you should really try to watch the videos in sequence. So that's one line. And a line that I have not talked about at all, but that scares a lot of people away from playing the fantasy, thank you, Kavita, for gifting to Mamba on Discord, is a move that first was pioneered by Badur Jabava, one of the top Caro-Kann experts, and that's queen to b6, putting immediate pressure on the d4 pawn, okay? And in the context of this video, I will limit myself just to one variation. I'm sure we're going to get the Caro-Kann again. Once we're 18 or 1900, I'm going to show you kind of the full theory after knight c3. So here, black's best move is again to play e6, but a very scary move that trips a lot of people up is actually e5. And the idea of e5 is very straightforward, right? You're forcing d takes e5, and you're bringing the bishop out to c5. And visually, it's terrifying because there's a check on f2. And the knight on g1 is literally hanging. So you can't just go e takes d5. You blunder the knight on g1. So does anybody know what the move here is for white? There is a very important move. And if you remember this move, there's no problems here. White is better. Knight a4 is absolutely right. Anytime you have a queen on b6 and a bishop on c5, you have to remember this idea of sticking the knight on the rim. And the point is that, okay, there's two moves. There's queen a5 check, but bishop f2 is what could look terrifying. Do not go king d2 and get checkmated. Make sure that e3 is still protected. But this, if you look carefully, forces black to acquiesce to the queen trade. The queen has to keep contact with the bishop, so black has to go queen d4. Now, you trade queens. I've played this with black, actually, quite a few times. And here, it's important to realize that you actually want to keep the e5 pawn protected. So the best move is just to go f4. And yes, you give back the pawn, but after bishop e3, eliminating black's strongest piece, black can throw in a check. Big deal. You just go king f2. And when the smoke clears, white is clearly better because black is struggling to keep this pawn protected. The knight can jump into c5, and you've just got a big pawn majority on the king side that you can push forward with h3 and g4. And you can keep analyzing this on your own if you want to deepen your knowledge, but that's basically all you have to know if you're under 2200. So the second move here is queen a5 check, and now the key detail is c3. Remember this concept because you're opening up a defense on the queen. This is a very, very common technique in a lot of different openings. A lot of different openings. In the French, you actually get a very similar idea. Very similar idea. Let me remember in which line. So I think it's in the knight c3 line. There's a variation of the French, the classical line, so very similar to the fantasy, where you get, you get the main line, and then let me remember how, so it's queen b6, and here the traditional move is knight to a4. Same concept. Queen a5 check. Are we losing the knight? Do we need to go back? No. We play c3. And the fascinating thing is that after c takes d4, white has a brilliant intermediate move. Does anybody know what it is? It's b4, counterattacking the queen and forcing it back. There is a sack on b4, but that's not very good. And then you take back on d4. What is the purpose of this move? Why not knight takes d4? Because then, then you get burned for putting the knight on a4. Black takes it, and black goes b5, and the knight is unfortunately trapped on a4. So again and again, these concepts are generalizable to a lot of different openings. Even if you're a d4 player watching the speedrun, you can take a lot of these ideas and you can apply them, in most cases, to the openings that you play. So once again, after e5, de, bishop c5, knight a4, queen a5, c3, black can take on g1, but crucially, if black plays b5, the contact between the queen and the c5 square has been severed, so you have this escape square for your knight. White is considered to be clearly better here, according to opening theory. If d takes c4, then you can bring your queen up to d4 and centralize it, and you've got a big initiative. So that's what I'll limit myself to in terms of opening remarks for this game. Now let's get to the actual game continuation. DE and knight f6. And again, I won't beat a dead horse here. We've already discussed in the previous game why this type of line is bad for black. It's an inferior version of an Caro-Kann, which is already a dubious opening. And after knight b6, important detail, right? We delay knight f3. We wait for black to bring the bishop out, and only then do we develop the knight to f3. So for the time being, both sides, I think, are playing pretty logically. Bishop d3, trade on d3. It's already almost +2 according to the engine, just so you know how bad a position like this is. And again, c5 is met with d5. This is important. Bishop e7, castles, castles. And here we decided on a very ambitious approach, knight e4. And I think the big question here would have been, what is our move against h6? And what I was planning here, from my perspective, is a slow, well, not a slow move. I had in mind a very interesting move that might actually turn out to be slightly overzealous, but the engine does like it. And that's the move knight to d6. Wow. And Perturb, you basically got it. You basically got it. But starting with c5 is good, but far more inflexible, right? You only want to play c5 if you absolutely need to. And knight d6 is working tactically, because if black takes twice, then you go c5 with a fork. And this is just incredibly unpleasant. We can support the pawn with c5. Black can barely breathe here. I mean, this is just a terrible position. But what's interesting is that the engine also gives a very nice attacking option. You can go g4. Using this pawn as a hook, you can just, bring this pawn up to g5, and this is pretty devastating as well. c5, you don't care. Just go g5. Close your eyes and attack. And all black can do is take the pawn, but who cares about the center if you're checkmating your opponent? The priorities have shifted. And this is an important general point that I want to make. A lot of people, they, make sure that you don't think of, you have to think of everything in relative terms. What was important a couple of moves ago might be totally insignificant now. A couple of moves ago, we didn't have our attack going yet, so it was crucial for us to keep our center intact. Once we've decided that we're going for mate, that becomes the only important thing. We don't care about our center anymore as long as we are able to keep essentially black's queen at bay. We're able to prevent the queen trade, which we are because the knight defends the pawn. Now we're aiming squarely for checkmate. We don't care about the integrity of our center. And here after g takes h6, g6, knight f, g5, I mean, just look at this. Look at this. This is totally devastating. Knight c6. Now the engine gives the cute move queen to g3, x-raying the g6 pawn. And if black makes a random move, knight takes f7 is game over, red rover, because queen takes g6. And notice the pawn on h6 fulfills a defensive role, stopping rook g7. Otherwise, black would be winning. So multiple options here to achieve a decisive advantage. Very aggressive with g4, or positional with knight d6, or even just rook d1. Nothing wrong with the Soviet school of chess approach. Again, prophylaxis against c5. You're totally overwhelming here. So lots of options. Our opponent decided on knight a6. And here, knight fg5 is essentially devastating. So if black had taken with the bishop, just to reiterate what I was saying, bishop takes g5 here I think might be even more convincing than knight takes g5. Because after black moves the queen, we have the simple mating pattern, knight f6 check, and then bishop takes f6. And just look at black's king. Queen g3 pre-move, rook f4, rook g4, whatever you want to do. This is utterly and completely devastating. The one thing that you want to avoid here, black can move the rook away, let's say to d8. If black moves the rook to e8, then you checkmate on g7. So a quick piece of advice, if you're on the defending side in these types of situations, and you're trying to move the rook away to give your king as much breathing room as possible, you often want to move the rook as far away as possible, but often that is actually d8. Because if you move the rook to b8, what's fascinating about this, we're going to use the method of comparison here. We're going to compare two different lines, and you're immediately going to see why one is better. Here, we drive the king out into the center, and here is where we want to compare two positions. After king c8, queen e8 is checkmate. But imagine that the rook was on d8 here. After king c8, the rook actually defends the e8 square. So the best compromise move is rook f8 to d8. And as white, you want to demonstrate patience here. Is there any hurry for us to give a check on g3? Absolutely not. Because if the king runs on its own volition, we can grab the pawn on h7. So we can use the opportunity to essentially tighten the screws of attack and just bring as many pieces into the attack as possible. Now, what's the most straightforward way of doing that? Don't block the queen's access to g3, though. So what's a nice way to bring another piece into the attack? It's the rook lift. And not just a rook lift, we're preparing to double our rooks on the f-file. And I'm giving you the engine line here because it's instructive. King f8, and just rook a f1. King e8, and now we can leisurely take the pawn. Why are we taking the pawn now? To prevent the king from running any further. Because now if the king runs any further, we just adopt the approach of taking all of black's material. Queen f7, and just bishop takes d8. Literally simple chess. Obviously, if queen takes d8, then we take and go rook f8 with winning. And if queen takes f7, then in this position, we give a check. And then we give another check. And we force the knight back to d7. And we take the free rook on a8. Is that the only winning line? Absolutely not. In fact, the engine, which is kind of evil, claims that the most clinical move is knight takes g5, and now a really sexy move. I love this next move. I'll give you a chance to find it. What do I love about it? Well, my favorite types of attacking moves are actually retreating moves. So you might think that the knight is the strongest piece. But what's the best square for the knight? If you could lift the knight and put it on any square on the board, what would it be? Well, it would not be g5. It would be the f6 square. The move is knight back to e4, threatening the infiltration of knight f6. Black is forced to play knight d7, and now we shift the queen over to h3. And the other great thing about moving the knight away is that we've opened up the pathway for the bishop now to infiltrate g5, or for the queen to step into h6. Why is it important for the queen to step into h6? Because if you play knight g5 immediately, you allow h5. So here the accurate move is either queen h6 or bishop to g5. The queen moves, and then we can literally do anything we want. I like the look of queen h6, followed by knight f6 with checkmate. So these details, again, is stuff that you can remember, right? Oh, this is an interesting idea. Let me look for retreating moves, and let me not be satisfied by pieces that look good on the surface. Let me try to find the best squares for them. So hopefully you found these lines to be somewhat illuminating. In the game, our opponent plays the other move, which is g6. Of course, h6, we have the discovery on f6, followed by checkmate on h7. So after g6, we had another dilemma. And most of you were kind of cheering for queen h3. But after queen h3, h5, I did not see a follow-up. What did I spend time calculating, you might ask? The move that I was trying to assess is actually not a good move at all. I spent a little bit trying to figure out rook takes f7, which is a classic idea. And I think the official name for this is demolition. The way this is referred to in books on tactics, like demolition of the opponent's pawn structure or of the king's pawn cover, where you basically sack a little bit of material and you completely obliterate the pawn shell. The problem is that you leave your back rank exposed. And the underlying problem is that we haven't developed our queen side. So after rook f7, queen e6, our old friend comes back to haunt us. Queen takes d4 check, and white loses. King h1, queen d1 is checkmate. So that's totally unnecessary. Knight takes f7 is similarly crappy because of queen takes d4 check, and the knight on e4 hangs with a total mess. But for every one of these examples where, you know, where rook takes f7 doesn't work, I can probably find you an example where this exact idea works perfectly, right? So all of this doesn't work only because the pawn on d4 is so vulnerable. Let me see if I can run a quick search and find an example of an idea like this working. So let me see. I'm going to run a quick search. I probably won't, but it's worth a shot. Let's take a look. As this search is going, where were we? We were talking about knight fg5, g6, and now I was explaining why I didn't want to go queen h3. Yeah, the reason is that this leaves the d4 pawn very exposed, and c4 is also hanging. So if we play bishop e3, suddenly black's back in the game. You know, knight takes c4, and unless you can figure out a concrete win on the king side, it's just not worth abandoning the center quite this early. Okay? So, here's a very nice game, actually. Actually, this is a pretty sexy game. So, it's not a famous game. It's just a game from the 90s. It's white to play in this position. And Amelang finds a way to capitalize on the same theme with two different tactical ideas. So white clearly has an attack here. How do I know that? Well, look at the queen. There's an open H file. and there's a potential mating square on h7. I call this thinking in terms of squares. What you do is you identify potential mating squares long before you actually see how you can exploit them, and that actually often helps you figure out the tactic. So if you think about it, the h7 square is a potential mating square. So you start thinking, can I go bishop takes g6? Well, the answer is no. It's way premature, right? Fg, not entirely convincing. Can I go rook f7? Also no, because after rook f7, you're not quite breaking through. You need a slightly more subtle way to break through the pawn structure, and such a subtle way exists. It's knight e6. Very nice. Knight e6. And if f takes c6, then we have a very important intermediate step. We need to eliminate the knight. Bishop takes c5, bishop takes g6, and even though it's not a checkmate on h7 is literally unstoppable. Yeah, black has a bunch of checks, but none of them do anything. So hopefully that makes sense. Black gives a check on b6 here. White calmly steps away. And now watch what happens. Black plays bc. So black is trying to mix things up on the queen side and distract white. Now a brilliant retreating move. The knight from e6 drops back to g5. Suddenly, it's an attacker again. Black's rook moves away from d8. And now the reason that I'm showing you this game, white to play and win most efficiently. Everything is winning. Even bishop takes e5. But I love the way that white finished this game off. Rook takes f7. Here's an example of this idea working. Breaking through the pawn chain, and now bang, 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 and black resigned because queen takes c7 is a beautiful mate. So there you have it, right? An example of rook takes f7 working in a different set of circumstances, which should be the centerpiece of your attitude and mentality in chess. Something doesn't work in one position doesn't mean the whole idea is wrong. It's because of the specific circumstances of the game. But hopefully you enjoyed that little illustration. Let's go back to the game. So any questions about this position after queen h5, queen h3, h5? Were there any attempts that people wanted to test out that were tempting you? So Snipey Snop says yes. Oh, g4. So I mentioned this during the game. The reason g4 is ineffective or not as effective as it may appear has to do, I think, with bishop takes g5. For starters, the idea is that after bishop takes g5, queen takes d4 check, the knight is suddenly undefended. And if you have to go here, I mean, this is yucky. You've given up your center. You don't have anything to show for it. And if you play knight takes g5, then after queen takes d4, black is threatening a forced queen trade. And white is no longer better. White is no longer better. Queen takes g4, and your attack is evaporated. So I'm impressed that people know this idea of playing g4. But again, you have to keep your center under wraps. But for that reason, we decided to cash in with knight f6 check, and he takes f6. And I think here was perhaps the last opportunity for black to prolong the game. In the game, h5, knight takes c6 leads to immediate victory for white. According to the engine, the only defensive move here, and it doesn't even really defend, was e5. e5. But after e5, we can proceed with our plan of knight takes h7. We can proceed with our plan. And the idea is king h7, queen h3, and queen h6. Totally meaningless check, and black is checkmated on g7. This is the lobster pincer, when we've got a piece on f6 and a piece on h6, and mate is unstoppable. Now, when you've got this construction, and I'm sure I'll talk about this more in other games, what do you have to be very careful about? You have to be very careful that black cannot use a knight to protect the g7 square. People often forget that this can be defended against with a knight from e6 or e8. And again, what kills black is the lack of proximity of the knights to the king side. Neither knight has the option of reaching e6 here. But if black's knight was on c7, this would not have worked because of knight e6. Because of knight e6. Okay, so often when you're dealing with situations that involve a lobster pincer mate, you have to make sure that you've covered the e6 square. And I actually have a super cool illustration of that from a high-level grandmaster game. Let me see if I can find it before we move on. Here you go. I might have shown this once on stream before, but I don't think most people will be familiar with it. It's a crazy position. Sambuyev against Wei. Now, what's going on in a position like this? Very often, I think people get overwhelmed because you feel like you're getting carried away by the current and you don't know where to start. Well, you should start somewhere, and you should usually start just by asking yourself if there are any tempting moves that kind of call your attention. Well, first you should start with the material count. What's the material count? Well, material is actually, believe it or not, kind of equal. Black is up 2 pawns. That's all there is to it. Neither side is up any pieces. So first thing I'll point out is that taking the rook is not effective because, okay, black takes back, and black has 2 pawns for the exchange. And without a knight, it's going to be very, very difficult for us to continue our attack. White should play for checkmate here. And all of you should see the move knight f6 check. And it's easy to conclude that this is checkmate. But this is the point that I'm making. Black has knight d6 to f5. And that's it. White's attack has fully evaporated. Not only does black defend g7, but he also tosses the queen out of h6. You have to move the queen back. That's it. Black is up 2 pawns. There's no more attack. I mean, black can go here. And, the tables have turned completely. So you might say, well, I see what I need to do. Let's get rid of the knight first. Let's play rook takes d6. That's, I think, how most of your minds are working. But you have to look at this concretely. You can't just say, oh, I'm going to eliminate the knight, and then it's going to work. Because captures change circumstances. Black takes back with the queen. And again, we have a problem where we can't go knight f6 this time because black simply takes twice and eliminates the pawn. You see what I'm saying? You have to look at it concretely. So the solution to the problem is actually a brilliant quiet move. Notice also that the knight on d7 is actually hanging, and bishop d4 fails for exactly the same reason. Black has knight f5. So you need to solve the underlying problem of knight f5. You need prophylaxis. You need a quiet move. It's not bishop f4 that blunders the knight on d7. There's only one way to defend f5 and protect d7, and that is bishop h3. It's the top engine move, and it's the only move that wins cleanly. And I think it's brilliant, right? To play such a move in such a sharp position is incredibly hard. And once you put a band-aid over the problem of the f5 square, the attack succeeds immediately. Because not only is white now threatening knight f6 check, white has an even simpler threat. Wei Yi in the game plays rook f to d8. Now, knight f6 check is actually not that simple because black has a second region from which he can defend g7. Black has knight e8. And white should be winning here after bishop f4, but the game continues. So instead, Sambuyev finds a different mating idea. Well, what other mating techniques are you familiar with when one side has a queen on h6 like this? Think about it. Well, you've got bishop d4, but then there's again knight e8. Not that convincing. But Mamba on Discord got it. Rook to d4 ends the game on the spot. Yeah, very nice. All of you are getting it. Rook d4. And Wei Yi resigned because after rook h4, it's checkmate in 2. There's no way to stop mate. None. The only way to stave it off is f5. But after queen h7, king f8, the quiet move, queen takes g6 ends the game because rook h8 is now basically unstoppable. Perhaps there's also forced mate, which I'm blanking on. Let me see. f5. Yeah, no, I think this is the simplest. This is the simplest. Queen takes h7 and queen takes g6. And everything collapses here. So that is the beauty of understanding these concepts. Bishop h3 is the only move that wins the game cleanly. And to prove this to you, I'm going to turn on Stockfish. Maybe I'll be put to shame because I last analyzed this game in 2017 when it was played. Maybe Stockfish 15 changes its mind, but I don't think it will. There you have it. Bishop h3 plus 7. Bishop h3 plus 7. Rook f d8, rook d4, rook d7, rook h4, here. Knight f7, rook to h7, and that's it. Black gets completely massacred here. Is it the only winning move? Let's test that out. If we add variation, it is. Look at this. The second best move is only plus 1.8. It's actually just to take the rook. It's just, and knight f6 check, black is basically winning. That's the key difference. That's all there is to it. Okay. So off we go to the game. A long way, a roundabout way just to tell you how important it is to never forget that lobster pincer does not necessarily mean unstoppable mate. Okay? So knight takes h7 here was winning, and it would have forced black to play queen takes d4 and give up an exchange in the endgame. This is a pretty straightforward technical victory because now we've got this monster pawn on f6. But that would have been the best way for black to keep going. After h5, knight takes c6, the game is totally over. Now, obviously, there was no need for black to play queen takes f6 and blunder another exchange. Technically, black should play here. But after rook a d1 or rook a e1, whatever you want, I'm not going to talk about this. This is completely and totally winning. Okay? So I think the decision to play knight f6 check and not to rush into it with queen h3, it really paid off. And we could have even played rook takes f6 here. I think this would have also been quite handily winning. Maybe even better than he takes f6. And if black plays knight d7, big deal. Just move the rook back to f1. Look at the dark squares on the king's side. The weakness of these squares is totally decisive. And if black plays knight takes e5, we use the technique I talked about in the game. Queen h3, queen takes d4, and bishop e3, double attack against e3 and h7. So multiple ways, multiple roads lead to Rome, but I think we chose the one that was most concrete and most safe and had a good compromise between still being fun, but not, arbitrarily giving away all of our advantages and taking too many risks. Yes, I know the engine move is this insane move, rook f6, but we're not going to talk about it. This is a ridiculous move. I don't even understand the idea of it. But, yeah, knight f6, I think, is straightforward and very strong. Any questions?